of the ABCs of CFB. As always, you have myself, Alec Pappas, and my co-hosts, Bryant Kraft and Chris Porritt. Coming to you with a different background than usual. I am in the wonderful city of Chicago this weekend, and it was beautiful weather yesterday and today. It's going to be incredibly cold tomorrow, but it was nice to get a little bit of that Midwestern, nice day in the winter action because Florida's been quite hot recently. But guys, excited to have this podcast. I did a little bit of calculation before the podcast, so we'll be excited to show our listeners our records, which have been pretty, a lot better than I anticipated. I thought I was absolute dirty brown water trash, but I'm not. It's not good, but it's not quite as bad. So we'll start off real quickly, give you guys an update on the records overall. So Chris is leading the way right now at 19-11 overall. He's 5-3 on his locks. Bryant pacing second, and it's really just because he has had to not join us, I think, on 2 episodes, or maybe it was just one. But he's 14-11 overall, 6-2 on his locks, which is pretty impressive. And I am pacing third, 13-19 overall, 3-5 on the locks. But that isn't as bad as I at one point was 8-16. So I haven't been too bad the last couple of weeks. But given that, and I'll post that when we do post this podcast. But it's pretty interesting. Chris, what are your thoughts on you just being electric this year?
Sorry about that. Dog.
Oh, Soph.
Yeah, no, honestly, I just have to thank, the Barstool Sportsbook app, first of all, our podcast sponsor. But no, honestly, I just think that sticking to kind of teams that I've watched quite a bit and have been familiar with has been helpful. And I think, kind of making the picks Big Ten centric, and then including, selected matchups from other conferences that I've read about and previewed, that's been helpful. But yeah, I mean, other than that, there's no secret formula.
CP, what it really is it's that wedding glow up. CP got married in August. He's a married man now. He's more confident, more sure of himself, and yeah, the picks are just coming to him.
And Brian, what about you with your locks? 6-2? That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, similar to what CP says. This year I've just been trying to stick more to games that I've followed, that I've got my finger on the pulse, and not try to be a little too outlandish and make any big upset predictions.
Yeah, for sure. And mine has just been the absolute grind of coming back from a bad start. I'm putting in work on these picks these last couple of weeks, and hopefully I can continue with that momentum this weekend. But why don't we start off talking just briefly about last week? It was a few pretty interesting games, right? I think like my biggest takeaway was we were all, I believe, pretty spot on when it came to that Georgia-Tennessee game. I know specifically Brian and I said, I think Georgia's the much better team. The thing that was interesting, and I'd love to get your guys' take on that game, which is talking about how Georgia went up pretty quickly in that first half, and I thought they were going to blow them out, and then they didn't. So I'd be curious to hear what your guys' thoughts on that game, Tennessee as a team, because now Tennessee, because they kept it close scoreboard-wise, they're in a pretty good position to make the playoff if they went out for the rest of the year. What are your thoughts, Brian?
Yeah, I think it's similar to sort of how Georgia's played in the past. Yeah, I had made the assumption that they were too much for Tennessee to handle playing in Athens. I think Tennessee's strength is the passing game, and Georgia's strength on defense is their defensive backfield. So it played out pretty much how I expected it to. But yeah, I think the most interesting thing coming out of that game is Georgia not pulling away, Tennessee keeping it within 14, and the rest of their schedule sets up pretty well for them to win their next 3 games, and they're going to be in a really good spot to sneak into the 4th seed of the playoffs.
Yeah, I agree. Chris, you have any other thoughts
Yeah.
on that game or other games of that past weekend?
Yeah, I think it was looking like Georgia was going to start pulling away a little bit. And I think it was just kind of a combination of, Tennessee has played a couple big games recently. And then this was their first, like, huge game on the road. And I think that Georgia kind of, jumped out and took advantage of that. And Tennessee was a little shell shocked. And then I think that the weather in the second half is kind of what brought things a little bit closer. And it, just kind of prevented either team from doing a ton. But obviously Tennessee was more desperate in those situations, so they were trying to make larger plays. They were trying to, be a little bit more aggressive in scoring, and that typically tends to favor the team that is trying to catch up in that scenario versus the team that's trying to just kind of like not turn the ball over, successfully punt it away. Not really,
Yeah.
put themselves in bad situations where they can give up the lead quickly on short fields. So yeah, I thought it went about the way that all three of us had mentioned the game would go. I think we both thought that Georgia, especially at home, was like I think we all said like 10 to 14 point favorite in that game or should win by that amount. And I think we were all pretty much spot on with that one.
Yeah, for sure. And then the only other thing that is interesting that we talked about a little bit was the Ohio State game and how they kept it a little bit closer against Northwestern than maybe many anticipated. I also, I certainly understand the weather aspect of that. Ohio State's a passing first team. Weather comes into play, especially with 50-mile-an-hour winds. Going to be tough for them to move the ball. My biggest thing though of that game was really just like Ohio State, for them to not only win the Big Ten, but to actually be what everybody thought, which is a national title contender, and against Georgia specifically. They had to have the balance of running the ball, and they couldn't. They were without a running back, which I understand, but it was very shocking to me that they weren't as they didn't have the success that I would have anticipated against a bad Northwestern team running the ball. But what were your guys' thoughts on that game, Brian?
Yeah, the thing for me in that game, and we've talked about it a little bit, is just Ryan Day's game planning is just very puzzling a lot of times. In that game in particular, I watched a good portion of it, and you knew from the kick that Northwestern was planning for this weather. They had prepared, they game planned around it. They knew the forecast. They were running. They weren't even trying to throw. They were running a lot of wildcat, putting the ball in the hands of their running back, and on the defense, they were selling out to stop the run. So it was clear that they game planned around the weather and tried to use it to their advantage. And on the other side, Ohio State didn't at all. Like the first half, they were still trying to throw the ball down the field with CJ Stroud, and the ball was going all over the place, and receivers couldn't track it because of the wind, and it just made no sense. So Ohio State obviously pulled away. They scored 21 unanswered. I don't think the game was ever in balance, but for me the biggest thing was I still think there are a lot of question marks about Ryan Day as a coach and a game planner.
Yeah, for sure. Chris, any other thoughts on that game?
Yeah, I think that we saw it a little bit with the Michigan State Illinois game. Just the fact that those games were played in the same state, obviously being right next to Lake Michigan, has a massive impact on the amount of wind and how strong the wind is. But I think you saw it in both games. Neither team was super comfortable throwing the ball. I think Peyton Thorne's first pass got caught up in the window a little bit. Probably also wasn't necessarily like a great play call. But yeah, I think that Ohio State, it was just a really odd game plan. I thought that for some reason, and this is, I think, a difference between Ryan Day and Urban Meyer, is that Urban Meyer wanted a quarterback that was able to run the ball pretty effectively and would run their quarterback quite a bit. So it was usually more of like a stockier built guy like JT Barrett, who was just probably the perfect quarterback for his system. Whereas Stroud is not really like that. He's a little bit more slight, and he's a little bit more of a finesse runner too. So like they're not running the type of offense in general that Ohio State used to run under Urban. And I think that I think that once they kind of realized that they needed to be a little bit more varied in their run game, and whether that's by design, whether they have to because Northwestern's playing it well, or if it's just kind of what's going to work in this scenario. I think they finally realized that, rolling Stroud out and letting him just not even have the option to throw, just run the ball, it really opened things up. And I think if Ohio State had come out that way, that's probably like a 35, 35-7 or 35-10 game or something like that. But instead, Ohio State was kind of better, bashing their heads against the wall and didn't get anywhere for a while. So I think we saw that play out.
Yeah, and I mean, Stroud just doesn't like to run. Like, even when I'm sure the coaching staff was like, hey, you're going to see this guy crash down. So, like, keep it yourself. And he ran for, I think, like 76 yards and he threw for 74 yards. So, in my mind, I agree with you that Urban Meyer's style of Ohio State's offense is like a better situated offense to win, I think, like in the Big Ten. Whereas maybe Ryan Day's is like when you do have an elite defense paired with his style of offense, it can work really well. But yeah, CJ Stroud is just vastly different than even the Justin Fields. So you need somebody that can be a bit of a running threat. And yeah, Stroud, you can just tell he's a bit timid when it comes to running anyway. But and then we saw a couple other upsets. Alabama lost. Who else lost? Clemson lost. Was happy to see my pick there about Clemson being overrated come to fruition. But now on the flip side, that Notre Dame Ohio State game is looking a bit better for Ohio State. And I think Notre Dame's on the uptick here to close out the year. It'll be very interesting to see how they play against USC. I think that's coming up in a couple of weeks. But were there any other things that stood out to you guys, Brian or Chris, on the weekend's game slate last week?
No, I think you touched on it a little bit, but the win for LSU was huge, and I hate Brian Kelly so much, but going for two and getting it like that,
that was
at
awesome.
home, and now they're in the driver's seat in the SEC West. They have 3 games left, but they're going to be favored in them all. Bama's really out of contention. It's one of those things that you hate it both ways. You don't want to see Alabama win, but you really don't want to see Brian Kelly win. So, yeah, I was not happy about that result.
Yeah. Chris, anything else?
Yeah, I think you mentioned it with Notre Dame. I think that you guys will remember a few weeks ago, it was prior to Notre Dame playing Stanford at home. Yep. I thought that, they had just beaten BYU, who in my mind, BYU was maybe not a good team, but like fairly solid team. So I was thinking that at that point, Notre Dame was kind of on the upswing, and then they lost at home to Stanford, which I still don't really have, I'd have to go back and like watch the film on that to see what happened. So, but I agree. I think Notre Dame is clearly kind of on the upswing right now. And I'm not sure who they play this weekend, but I mean, I guess it kind of sets up like last time where they had, played BYU really strongly and then had a letdown against Stanford. So maybe I should have Notre Dame and whoever their opponent is on my card this weekend, because maybe Notre Dame's going to have another, just kind of fall flat on their face performance.
They're at Navy. Navy's decent, but
yeah. Not really the type of game that you would see Notre Dame losing
necessarily. They're better than Marshall, so who knows?
Yeah. So maybe take Navy this weekend, but that's not on my card. But yeah, Notre Dame, I think they've got something right now.
I know. I was hoping that Notre Dame would continue to crash a bit because they are recruiting really well, and that would be ripe pickings for Michigan or Michigan State, but that doesn't seem to be coming to fruition at all. But let's go ahead and transition then to talking into this week's games, and specifically Michigan State and Michigan. Michigan State is playing against Rutgers, and I gave a little preview to Brian about my pick for the weekend. So I'm going to actually give just a little analysis on this because it is going to be on my card. And in fact, one of these aspects is my lock of the weekend. So I'm going to defer over to Chris to start us off on what his thoughts are about this game and overall, like, what do you think is going to take place with the matchup on Saturday?
Okay. Well, I'll start off by saying that it's not on my card. I will be at the game tomorrow, so I decided to keep my dad company, and we're gonna go up there and watch some football on Saturday. So I'm excited for that. But yeah, honestly, I think this game, I think the two most likely outcomes are I think the most likely outcome is a close defensive battle. Over under, I think, is like 40 points or so. I do think Michigan State will win. But I think the most likely scenario is a low scoring battle where MSU wins maybe 27-17, something like that. And then, but I also could see a scenario where MSU comes out and is just, beats them up from the start. I think that Rutgers has some things going for them in this matchup. The fact that they have a solid defense. I believe they're top 30-ish in overall defense, and that includes they have a good passing defense and a decent running defense. So I think it really kind of matters how Michigan State comes out. If they're able to run the ball, kind of like they did against Illinois, then I think it could be a very long day for Rutgers. But if MSU has to just, sit back there and throw a bunch of passes to get first downs, then I think that's exactly what Rutgers wants, and that will be a long day for Michigan State. And that's how I could see the upset happening is if Michigan State, isn't really able to run the ball for whatever reason, and then they have to pass a lot, which I think would really play into Rutgers' strengths as a pretty good passing defense. So I'll leave it there and pass it to Brian.
Yeah, Brian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just setting the stage. I mean, Rutgers is not good at all. Their offense is bad. They have quarterback issues. A lot of trouble moving the ball. But that being said, like you said, CP, they have a stout defense. It's not nothing special, but it's solid, and solid special teams. And Shiano is a good coach. So I'm a bit nervous, but mostly I'm nervous just on the Michigan State side. I prefaced it with you, Pappy, but Michigan State has been so up and down this year. You never really know what you're going to get from them week to week. I think most people were expecting Illinois to blow us out last weekend, and then we saw what happened. So I think the biggest thing for me is just I want to see Michigan State sort of build on what they accomplished last week and get better. I also want to see the running game progress. I thought that last week was the first time that we really controlled the line of scrimmage. We're doing some good things schematically and opening up lanes for the running back. So I want to see that happen. I think it's going to be a close game. I could see us winning around 10. I think the spread's about right. It's going to be cold in East Lansing tomorrow. I think it's high 30s for kickoff, so that could impact the passing game if we're not able to run. But I think overall we should win comfortably, and yeah, I want to see us build on the momentum that we established last week. I think again, we talked about it before, but getting bowl eligible is so huge for this program and the young players that we have. We need those extra practices, and we need sort of that momentum going into next year. So we've got to get it done on Saturday.
Yeah, I'm gonna actually just save my brief analysis for my lock because it will be hard for me to give an unbiased viewpoint on that without giving away what I'm gonna pick. So Chris, you're raising you were raising your hand again. Yes. What would you like to say?
My hands up. One thing I forgot to mention, and Bryant made a good point, so I wanted to just quickly mention it, is I do feel like really since I guess maybe you could even include the Maryland game in this, but almost since the Minnesota game, I feel like MSU has built towards kind of a semblance of playing at least decently well each week. I think that, Maryland, I think it was a tale of two halves. They played pretty well in the first half, and then second half the offense fell off. I don't think MSU played terrible against Ohio State. I think Ohio State was just way, way better at that point in the year, and MSU was still dealing with a lot of injuries. And then, but I feel like from Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, and those games were all in a row. I feel like MSU has harnessed a pretty consistent level of effort, play, execution. Hasn't meant they've won those games. Michigan I think was just simply a better team playing MSU again, under strength, and was just a better team in general. But I think against Wisconsin and Illinois, you saw more consistency. So I expect them actually to play fairly consistent, and I expect them to play pretty well tomorrow. So I'll just leave it there.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. And a lot of things you guys are saying are aligned to my aspect of thinking here. So we'll go ahead and talk about Michigan briefly. They're playing at home to Nebraska. It actually is kind of funny. There's a unofficial trophy game attached to this one, and it's with Taylor Lewan and Will Compton, who are podcasters and one's a current, other former NFL player, where it's called the Bussin' Bowl, and they actually got Jim Harbaugh and at the time Scott Frost and the athletic directors to sign off on this being the Bussin' Bowl. And so it'll be pretty funny. I'm sure they'll have some pretty good content from behind the scenes associated to the game. But Michigan's plus 30, and that is a huge spread. Casey Thompson is out for Nebraska, which is definitely not great for them. And I just think, yeah, Nebraska, they're just in a tough situation, right? They got interim coach. Very likely he isn't going to be the next coach of Nebraska. I think that they're just trying to get through this season. I'm actually hopeful that Nebraska hires the Kansas coach because I think he would do some serious damage there, or at least make them a good program. Also, continue to hear rebellings about Matt Campbell at Iowa State. But from the game's perspective itself, this is going to be a little shocking. But from last week's game against Rutgers, I was actually happy with the quote unquote progress of Michigan's passing game. And I'll elaborate a little bit. Is even though JJ McCarthy only passed for like 157 yards against Rutgers, the offensive coordinators actually took shots down the field. He took a long shot to Andrell Anthony, took a long shot to Ronnie Bell, took a long shot to Luke Schoonmaker, which I thought was an incredible throw that unfortunately Schoonmaker didn't make the catch in the end zone. Another one to Ronnie. And so what I'm trying to say is this was the first game that I can remember in several weeks that they were actively trying to get the passing game going. And I think that's going to continue this next week as well. They'll certainly lean on the run game a bit. But when I was doing a little bit of research before this game, Nebraska doesn't have the best pass defense. They just don't have the best defense this year. So I still think they're going to try to get JJ and the passing game going a bit. I've resided to the fact that it'll never be like what I'm hoping it was going to be with JJ this year. I think if that was ever to take place, it'll have to be next year. Give him a whole off season to, work with as a starter, spring practice, summer. Next year is just when you're going to have to hope. But I think they're going to continue to work on this. I'm not putting this on my card, but I overall feel comfortable that Michigan is going to perform quite well. They're in the last aspect of the season, right? And they got everything in front of them. They're playing motivated. And I see this as being a pretty comfortable win. But Brian, what are your thoughts on this game?
Yeah, no, I think a comfortable low stress win for you is definitely going to happen tomorrow. I think for me, it's sort of two things. I think the only two things that Michigan really needs to focus on right now are, one, staying healthy. It sounds like they are starting to get banged up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So Nebraska has no chance of beating them. So I think it would be smart to rest some guys and make sure that they're healthy for the next 2 weeks. But then the other thing is you see the sort of the national playoff picture come into shape. I think they should start thinking about some, blowing people out and getting those
style points.
Yeah, the style points. I think it could come into factor this year. I think the sentiment is the loser of Ohio State, Michigan won't get in. But if you look at, if TCU loses, if Oregon loses again, who's going to be that fourth team? It could very well be the loser of the Michigan Ohio State game. And I think to give them the best leg there, it's going to be to continue to have that the high margin of victory. So I think that is something that they should consider.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Is there any other games that you guys want to highlight before going into talking about like our picks for the weekend? Because I didn't have any other games that I really wanted to highlight, but I admittedly didn't look to see like what those big old games of the weekends were. So I don't know, Chris, any national ones?
There's just a couple of mention. The one that I think will be really interesting, just kind of like the Oregon UCLA game a few weeks ago. I think Washington at Oregon this weekend. It's a night game. I could see that playing out really similarly to how the Oregon UCLA game at Oregon played out. I think that Oregon's defense is good enough at this point in the season where they're gonna limit Washington somewhat. It's not gonna be like Washington putting up 450 passing yards or anything like that. I think the spread is somewhere like 10 to 13 points in favor of Oregon. And I think Oregon is a fairly safe bet on that game. I think Washington will really, really struggle to stop Oregon in general, especially with the game being, at Autzen at night. But I think Washington will put up some points as well. I didn't look at the over under, but I would probably go with the over in that game as long as it's not like, raining and windy like it was last weekend in the Pacific Northwest. And then there's just, TCU Texas, which, I was kind of surprised to see that Texas was a 7.5 point favorite, and I'll have more info on them in my picks. But I think that's going to be an interesting game. Unfortunately, I think it's at the same time as Washington and Oregon.
Yeah. Okay. Any other games or from your side, Bryant?
Yeah, the only other one that we talked about was Alabama at Ole Miss. I think from a betting standpoint, it's one I'm definitely gonna stay away from, but it's just has a lot of interesting aspects. Bama is out of the SEC West, probably out of the playoffs as well. Ole Miss is right in the thick of it though, with just one loss. They could definitely win the West and make it to the SEC championship game. Ole Miss is at home. Ole Miss is better with their run game than their pass game this year, and Alabama's better with their defense and their rush defense and their pass defense. But Alabama, I think, is like 13-point favorite, so I think it's just a really interesting game all around. So one I'm going to stay away from, but we'll be following it closely to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I actually have that on my card, so that could be a good transition for us here to get into talking about our picks for the weekend. So like I gave you guys at the beginning of this, we have some updated records of what we have been our picks have looked like for the year. Excuse me, fumbling over my words. But I'll go last here. Bryant, why don't you start us off with your picks for the weekend? And as a reminder to the listeners, Brian is 14-11 and 6-2 on his locks. So definitely lock into his lock picks.
Yeah, so I will start with my lock then. So it's Wisconsin at Iowa. It's a pick 'em right now. I'm taking Wisconsin as my lock, even though it is at Iowa, and Iowa is a decently hard place to play. I think Wisconsin's just in a better place as a team right now. They got some things working on offense, and their defense is always stout. So I like Wisconsin to win that game. That's my lock. I got LSU at Arkansas. So the over under is 61.5. I've got the under there. Arkansas has struggled pretty immensely on offense the past few weeks, and LSU isn't super explosive on offense either. So I like the under 61.5 there. Sticking with SEC over under is I got Missouri at Tennessee. The over under is 57. I like the over there. I think this is a week that, Hendon Hooker struggled mightily last week. 0 touchdowns. I think he had like 180 yards in a pick. I think he's going to try to put up some big numbers. I could see this one being like 56 to 28 or something like that. So I like the over 57 there. I've got to stick with my boy Drake May. I've got UNC at Wake Forest. I got UNC +4. Wake's struggling a little bit, and yeah, I think Drake May just makes them really dangerous, and is going to keep that one close. And I like UNC to cover if not win it. And then my last one, I've got Baylor -2.5 at home versus Kansas State. Baylor they've got a lot of momentum right now after a sluggish start to the season. They won 3 straight. They beat Oklahoma, Texas Tech, and I think Iowa State the last 3 games. So a lot of momentum. And K-State's coming off a tough loss to Texas. They're banged up. So I like Baylor to cover at home -2.5.
Nice. I love them. We have a couple of overlaps there with my picks, but all told, with all of yours, I would agree with every way you're leaning. Chris, what about you?
Yeah, I also have some overlap with Bryant, and I'll just mention that one first because I wasn't really sure which way I was going to go on this one, but I also like Wisconsin to cover, and I just trust both units at Wisconsin more than I trust Iowa's offense is basically what this comes down to.
Yeah.
And then just because of Ohio State last weekend, I didn't their offense looked not great. I like and it mainly because of the spread. It's 40.5. I like Indiana to cover at Ohio State. I think 40.5 is just way too many points for Ohio State to cover when I think they'll probably give up maybe 14, 21 points or so against Indiana. Staying in the Big Ten, just because I think that their offense was stifled by one combination of good defense and also terrible weather last weekend. I actually like Maryland to cover 10.5 at Penn State this weekend. I think this could be, the last game of the year that Maryland like really gets up for. I think they have Ohio State next weekend as well, but I think that because of how last weekend went at Wisconsin, Maryland's going to be really up for this game. And then going to the Big 12, as I mentioned, I like TCU to cover 7.5 at Texas. I think that's just kind of a strange line and too many points simply. So I like TCU there. And then my lock of the week, and this is also because it's kind of a bounce back after a pretty poor performance on the road. But I really like Clemson -7 at home against Louisville.
Versus Louisville. Got it. Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see Clemson just because I really don't think they're a good team. And they got QB questions. It'll just be very interesting, but I agree, like Louisville isn't all that good. So it'll be certainly interesting to see how they bounce back. Good picks overall, Chris. I'll go in and get into mine then. So I'll start off. So the one that I went back and forth on this, but it's one I still want to put on my card. It's Ole Miss +12 against Bama. It's playing at Ole Miss. And Bama's coming off a gut-wrenching loss that essentially knocked them out of not only the SEC championship game, but the college football playoff. So they also, which I know you hate to do this with like college football in hindsight, but Bama could easily have 4 losses right now. The 2 to Tennessee and LSU, and then they won by 1 point to Texas. They beat Texas A&M on a last-second stand, and Texas A&M isn't a good team. So I just like Ole Miss. I'm not saying they're going to win, but Ole Miss is a pretty decent team, and they were up on LSU pretty quickly when they played LSU. So I could see this as well, just Bama being a little unmotivated, Ole Miss still having, a great season thus far, covering that 12-point spread. Maybe Bama wins it by 10, something along those lines. Wisconsin, when I was looking on my sports book, they were -1 against Iowa. I'm taking Wisconsin. Feels like game's going to probably be ugly, but this is simply a game of Wisconsin playing good football right now. And you guys will get a kick out of this. They have next year starting running back Braylon Allen on their team. So I think that for Michigan. So I think that he'll have a pretty good game overall. And I'm only kidding on that, but I just like Wisconsin winning this game closely. North Carolina +4 against Wake, same exact thing Bryant said. I'm a fan of Drake May. Kind of shocking he's not getting more Heisman pub right now, because he's bordering on Deshaun Watson territory at Clemson. So we'll see, but I just like UNC pulling that game out. Next game is LSU. I was thinking about what you were saying, Brian. I liked what you were talking about when it said the under of that game, but I'm going LSU -3.5 against Arkansas. LSU's just playing with a lot of confidence right now. Arkansas is having a tough year. They're not a great offense. They're not a great defense. So I think LSU, while it might be close for 2 or 3 quarters, it'll certainly be one that LSU will pull away from. And then the last game, which is my lock of the weekend, is MSU -9.5 against Rutgers. I think that MSU is they're healthy, they're motivated. I know some guys are suspended, but you could see it in the Michigan game. Like they were as healthy as they had been nearly all season, and they gave Michigan, heck for a good 3 quarters. And I think that they're just a much better team than Rutgers. I watched that game last week with Michigan and Rutgers, and Rutgers just isn't good. That's as plain as it can be. So I think that MSU is going to come out, play motivated. They're going to throw the ball a bit. They got good wide receivers. They got a good defense now. Rutgers shouldn't be able to move the ball on MSU's defense. So this is just a 2-variable game. One, MSU, when healthy or somewhat healthy, is an above average team. And second, MSU is just more talented, and Rutgers is a little bit of a fugazi, if you will. They're a bit of a fake. So I like MSU to cover this game, win by somewhere in the neighborhood of 14 to 21 points, and that is going to be my lock of the weekend. I know as well, there is some college basketball that's playing tonight. This is a little bit off the cuff, but Chris, as our correspondent here, that's the expert on college basketball. What are your thoughts of the MSU Gonzaga game taking place tonight?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a tough game for, well, I guess taking into account the elements, the fact that it is outdoors on an aircraft carrier, there's going to be like maybe 8 to 10 mile per hour winds. I was texting some people this morning about this game, and I actually already bet on the under in this game. I think I got it at like 144.5. I don't see either team shooting very well from three, which MSU unfortunately relies on more than Gonzaga does. I think, one team could get hot and that could make a huge difference in a game like this, especially. But I think, Gonzaga's inside game is really going to, be emphasized tonight with the weather and everything. And the fact they have Drew Timme. So I think Gonzaga will probably win this game. If I had to bet on the, which team would cover, I mean, probably take MSU. I think Gonzaga will win by like 8 to 10 points. But I would bet on the under for sure.
Why is so is this it is like it's totally outdoors. They don't like guard against the weather at all.
There's there's like grandstands that surround the actual court itself, but I mean no, it's not covered, and then there is going to be wind.
Yeah.
That's like crazy. Go on, Brian. Sorry.
I looked up the stats of the UNC MSU aircraft carrier game just to sort of confirm this narrative, and there was only 6 combined threes made in that game, and both teams shot like 60% from the free throw line. Like shooting is going to be really difficult, and I think Drew Timme will be the difference. Gonzaga is going to win, but I really like that. If the over under is 144, I love that under.
I think honestly, I think you guys might. I think we probably all should just bet the under. I think it's just. I mean, the over under is similar to what like close to a national championship would be on in really good conditions. I just don't think. I don't even know if either team will score 70.
Yeah.
Hey, if you're confident in it, I'll bet it tonight. So I'm a new.
I already put a $25 on the under, so I'm just saying, not saying anybody else should do it, but
lock of the century.
Yeah, they so I'll definitely take a look at that under. That's still just so surprised. I thought they would guard against. I can't really remember the UNC MSU game where they played on the aircraft carrier, but that just is like when you play outside, sometimes the wind is going crazy and it's hard to shoot like on a playground. So this as well being elevated like that, I didn't quite realize all of that. So I agree with you, Chris, that would be a pretty smart move by us. But gentlemen, that was a good podcast, very efficient. Is there any last words that you guys want to leave our listeners with before we head out, Brian?
No, just the only thing is we've got 3 weeks left of the regular season for college football. It's coming to the end, so we got to make sure we enjoy it. Love to see CPs going up to East Lansing for the game tomorrow. I want to make it to Indiana next week, and just got to soak up these last few weeks of college football while we have them.
Yeah, for sure. Chris?
Yeah, Brian, I got at least one open ticket, so if you're free tomorrow, let me know. But yeah, I think it'd be huge for Michigan State just in general to get to 6 wins, at a minimum 6 wins and get the bowl practices. I think that would be huge in terms of, building the program in the first 3-ish years under Mel or so. But no, I think next week we're gonna have a lot to talk about with Michigan and Illinois. I think that's kind of a tough team to have to play right before Ohio State, just because, it's physical, whereas Ohio State plays Maryland, who's actually can be physical if they choose to be, like they were against Michigan. But yeah, I think there'll be a lot to talk about next week and some good matchups. So looking forward to it.
For sure. We'll leave it at that. But thanks as always to everybody listening. We're getting now into the hundreds of thousands of listeners, so we appreciate every last one of you. But this has been another episode of the ABCs of CFB. Good luck this weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.